Hello and welcome to the HistoryNetwork.org podcast. If you'd like to become a patron of the podcast, we would love you to. You can do so at patreon.com/the History Network. Thanks to all our patrons who make this podcast possible. The HistoryNetwork.org podcast, season 37, episode 1, Heroism in Borneo. This episode was written by Murray Dahm. Murray is an ancient and medieval military historian from New Zealand living in Australia. He has written more than 100 articles on various aspects of ancient and medieval military history, as well as other historical topics from all periods, ranging from the history of opera to the runic alphabet and recipients of the Victoria Cross. He is the author of Macedonian Phalangite versus Persian Warrior, Athenian Hoplite versus Spartan Hoplite, and Leuctra 371 BC, all from Osprey Publishing. He is, of course, a regular writer on here and a regular on the Ancient Warfare podcast. At the conclusion of the Malayan Emergency in July 1960, plans were put in place to incorporate British North Borneo and Singapore into Greater Malaysia. This idea was met with fierce opposition from President Sukarno of Indonesia, and in 1962 Indonesia began supporting revolutionary factions on the large, dense jungle island of Borneo. The confrontation proper broke out in December 1962 when companies of the North Kalimantan National Army (NKNA) attacked police stations in Sarawak and Brunei. British reinforcements were flown in quickly, the first two companies of the 1st 2nd Gurkhas arriving within hours. Other reinforcements soon followed, and by February 1963 all towns in Brunei and Sarawak had been cleared of rebels. The 1,600-kilometre border between Kalimantan and Sarawak, however, continued to be raided, and troops of the Gurkhas, Royal Marines of numbers 40 and 42nd Commandos, A Squadron of the 22nd Special Air Service, the armoured cars of the Queen's Royal Irish Hussars, and other units patrolled the border. All these troops amounted to some 14,000 men to patrol 1,000 miles of border, or only 14 men per mile. With so few troops along such a massive border, they were spread incredibly thinly. Indonesian troops continued to mount raids across the border from 1963. 34 attacks were launched across the border in July 1964 alone. These raids met with varied success. More Commonwealth reinforcements, code-named Spine Force, arrived in December 1963. Many of these patrols were Claret operations activities on the Kalimantan side of the border and designed to keep Indonesian forces on the defensive. These were instigated by Director of Borneo Operations, Major General Walter Walker, in July 1964, and would continue until July 1966 under his successor, Major General George Lee. During one such cross-border patrol in the Bau district, the extreme western edge of Sarawak, on November 21, 1965, men of C Company, 2nd 10th Gurkhas, located a platoon-strength, 30 to 40 men, enemy position entrenched on a sheer T-shaped hill, 500 feet, about 152 meters high. The only approach to this position was along a knife-edge ridge. C Company's commanding officer, Captain Hit Maunsell, had 100 men under his command. They had departed at 6 a.m. and taken 6 hours to approach the enemy position, unseen, and it was now nearly afternoon. The terrain was incredibly difficult, consisting of nigh-on impenetrable Bacula ferns, an advance of 150 meters an hour, was considered good progress. In November 1964, Lance Corporal Rambahadur Limbu had joined his battalion on Borneo to patrol the Sarawak border. In his brief autobiography, My Life Story, Rambahadur Limbu remembers how, as a young man, perhaps 15, he and two friends ran away from their Himalayan village of Chaingtapu to join the army as boy soldiers. Rambahadur had heard stories from his father, who had served in the Gurkhas during the Second World War fighting the Japanese. These stories inspired Rambahadur to want to be a soldier. His father died when he was 8, along with 9 other members of his family, leaving only Rambahadur and 2 brothers. Unfortunately, his first experience of army life was not what he expected, and he soon deserted and returned home. He left Chaingtapu again at 17 to seek work, first in Darjeeling and then in the Kingdom of Sikkim, but ended up almost accidentally joining the army again in November 1957 at 19, despite his fears that he might be recognized as the boy soldier who had deserted. He was not. He had grown from 4'4", 132 centimeters, to his adult height by then 5'3", 160 centimeters, and later assumed that that was why he was not recognized. He took the Gurkha oath of allegiance, his right hand on the Union Jack, repeating the oath in front of a portrait of Queen Elizabeth II. By December 1957, he was in Malaya, training at Sungai Latani. After 10 months of training, he joined the 2nd Battalion of the 10th Princess Mary's Own Gurkha Rifles at the Majidi Barracks in Johor Bahru in October 1958. He made several patrols during the next few years during the Malayan Emergency, but the enemy continued to elude his platoon's ambushes. He saw some dead insurgents killed by the 1st Battalion, but saw no real action himself, although he was made intimately aware of jungle operations. This experience would be invaluable in Borneo. He was promoted to Lance Corporal in 1963, and by that time serious troubles had begun in Borneo, especially Brunei and Sarawak. On the patrol of November 21st, 1965, the 3 men of Rambahadur's Bren Gun Support Group from 7 Platoon, he and Rifleman Karkabahadur Limbu, were in the van of the advance on the left of the enemy position. Rambahadur was in charge of positioning, directing and supervising the Bren gun, which his 2 riflemen operated, one carrying the ammunition and in charge of reloading, the other who carried the LMG and fired it. The men crept forward to within only 4 meters of the first enemy trench. When the machine gunner manning the trench spotted them, he immediately opened fire, and Bijuli Parsad to Rambahadur's right was hit. Rambahadur rushed forward alone and killed the sentry, taking possession of the enemy trench. The entire enemy force was now alerted to the Gurkhas' presence and opened fire on them, concentrating their fire on the trench, which Rambahadur occupied. Rambahadur realized that he could not support the advance of his own platoon from the enemy trench position, and so left the safety of the trench under sustained and heavy enemy fire in order to lead his Bren group to a better position some 25 meters away. He shouted and pointed his intentions to the platoon commander, Ranjit Rai, and then advanced yet again into a hail of enemy fire. In this second advance, both Bijuli Parsad and Karkabahadur were seriously wounded. According to his own recollection, seeing his comrade's blood made his own blood boil, and he thought blood for blood, and nothing but blood could settle the account. Seeing them wounded and incapacitated, however, he realized that he needed to aid them rather than continue the attack alone. Under furious and accurate enemy fire from at least 2 machine gun posts, Rambohada made his way towards his wounded men. He inched forward towards them, but as he reached out to the closest wounded man, he was driven back by enemy fire. Rambohada realized that only speed would allow him to rescue his comrades. He rushed forward and threw himself beside the first of them, directing 2 LMGs which had come up in support on his right. He hoisted the rifleman and carried him to safety. According to his Victoria Cross citation, the enemy now concentrated even more fire on Rambohada to prevent his rescue of his comrade. But the lance corporal made a series of short rushes to the side of the second wounded rifleman. At one point he was pinned down for several minutes by accurate fire, bullets striking the ground all around him. He reached the second wounded man, hoisted him onto his shoulders, and carried him to safety. The entire action took 20 minutes, and Rambohada was under sustained enemy fire for the whole duration. He later recalled, "I was under the shower of bullets, but not a single bullet had my name written on it." His citation noted that his outstanding personal bravery, selfless conduct, complete contempt of the enemy, and determination to save the lives of the men of his fire group set an incomparable example and inspired all who saw him. With typical humility, Rambohada's own account dwells far more on his feelings for his wounded comrades than on his own actions in the 3 bold attempts he made to rescue his colleagues. He also credits his short stature as the reason the enemy bullets passed over him, even though he spent much of the action pinned to the ground and behind scant cover. His account of his bravery is only 2 paragraphs, and he gives overwhelming credit to his commanding officers, Lieutenant Colonel P.O. Myers and Company Commander Captain C.E. Monsell, stating, "Whatever we achieved that day we could never have achieved without the brilliant planning and leadership of the 2. Later he maintained that the award is equally shared by all the officers and my fellow soldiers who were serving with me in the days of trouble." His citation, however, remarks on his bravery and astonishing survival. He displayed heroism, self-sacrifice, and a devotion to duty and to his men of the very highest order. His actions on this day reached a zenith of determined, premeditated valor, which must count among the most noble on record and is deserving of the greatest admiration and the highest praise. The citation also noted that he was able to achieve what he did against such overwhelming odds without being hit was miraculous. After rescuing his rifleman colleagues, Rambohada then rejoined the attack on the left flank. Once more under fire, he gathered up the LMG his wounded men had been forced to abandon. Several more riflemen joined him in the last charge on the enemy position, and Rambohada personally killed 4 of the enemy in the final firefight. The enemy force was destroyed, with 24 dead. The Gurkhas suffered 3 men killed and 2 wounded. Unfortunately, both the men Rambohada had rescued died of the wounds they had sustained. These casualties would have been far higher if not for Rambohada's brave actions and the inspiration he gave the men around him. His actions were part of a larger battle known as Gunung Tepoi, and at an hour long and with enemy casualties, one of the largest and longest actions of the entire campaign. In his autobiography, he speaks of a premonition he had the night before the action, for which he was awarded the Victoria Cross. He dreamed that his unit would be involved in heavy fighting and that he would be responsible for its failure or success. In his dream, he saw a glowing red arc of fire in front of his unit. A big red burning sun on the ground, is how he described it, and he alone stepped inside the arc, the other men afraid to step towards it. When he had stepped inside the arc of fire, he felt a strange kind of happiness, and at that moment he woke. Preparations to send Ram Bahadur to England to accept his Victoria Cross were made as soon as it had been gazetted. He arrived in late May 1966. Ram Bahadur spoke of the Gurkha desire to visit England at least once, and that he never expected to meet Her Majesty, Queen Elizabeth. He spoke only in Gurkhali and had to have an interpreter translate for him. His eldest son accompanied him to Buckingham Palace for his investiture on July 13th, 1966, and the Queen expressed her wish to meet with Ram Bahadur's son after the ceremony. Ram Bahadur was dismayed that his son played with the role of caps in the presence of the Queen, giving her a scare. For years he continued to remind his son that he was the only person in the world who had ever behaved in such a way before the Queen. On the train journey home to Nepal in 1967, Ram Bahadur's medal and all his belongings were stolen from his train carriage. A replacement Victoria Cross was issued along with his other service medals, which were also stolen. Ram Bahadur remained in the army and served for 27 years, attaining the rank of Queen's Gurkha officer, the equivalent of captain, although sometimes listed as lieutenant. At the time of writing this podcast, Ram Bahadur Limbu was 83 and the third eldest of the 5 surviving recipients of the Victoria Cross, the eldest being 102-year-old John Alexander Cruikshank and 89-year-old Keith Payne. Other living recipients are Johnson B. Harry, 2004 in Iraq, and Joshua Leakey, 2013 in Afghanistan. There are also 3 living recipients of the Victoria Cross for Australia: Mark Donaldson, 2009, Daniel Keegren, 2010, and Ben Robert Smith, 2011, all in Afghanistan, and 1 for the Victoria Cross for New Zealand, Willie Apiata, 2007, in Afghanistan. Thanks once again, Murray, for writing that episode for us. If you'd like to have a go at writing an episode for us, or you want to contact us and give us an idea for a subject that you think we've not covered yet, then just drop us a line, info@thehistorynetwork.org for that. And once again, please do consider becoming a patron of the podcast at patreon.com/thehistorynetwork. Once again, thank you to all our patrons who make this podcast possible. Thanks again for listening. You've been listening to the HistoryNetwork.org podcast, written by Murray Darm, read by Nick Barker.